Welcome back to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. I'm Mark Stanley, your host, and today we're going to finish our series on developing a Christian philosophy of art and beauty. Over the past 2 episodes, we have been asking whether art appreciation is purely a subjective experience or whether art finds value and grounding outside of ourselves. Last episode, we talked about how to appreciate art, how to judge art, and how to understand the role that art plays in human well-being, whether as an instrument for personal development or some intrinsic end in itself. Last episode was certainly the core of the series, and if you missed it, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to it. C.S. Lewis carries much of the weight of our Christian philosophy of art here at Well-Read Christian. What we said last episode comprises the bulk of the structure that I use to think about art and art appreciation. But there is still more to be said, and Francis Schaeffer is going to come in with some of the methods of analysis that I think are really important, or at least interesting. Some objective criterion for how to rate art, as if you were an art critic. And then I also want to introduce Schaeffer's view into the last episode's discussion of whether art is something which requires you to turn your brain off or turn it on. Schaeffer has a lot to contribute, and after we exhaust his little book, I'll end with some insights from a new Aristotelian philosophy, which is on the cutting edge of contemporary thought. Then, finally, I'll bring my own thoughts to put a bow on the Christian perspective of aesthetics. I'll also summarize what we've talked about so that you can really get a handle on everything we've discussed. But before we get started, please go to our social media outlets on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Like, follow, and subscribe to support our project. Leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have benefited from the podcast or believe in our mission, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support our work on our website, wellreadchristian.com. There you will find interesting quotes, sources, articles, and more available free of charge. These are tough times for all of us, and if your contribution would cause any amount of financial pressure, please do not even consider it. But for those who are willing and able to give, it is because of your gift that the podcast can continue and even grow. So thank you. Okay, so in my development of a Christian view of art, I think C.S. Lewis carries at least 70% of the load, but Schaeffer carries at least 25%, and then the last 5% is something special we'll talk about at the end, this neo-Aristotelian conception, which is at the cutting edge of contemporary aesthetics. And, of course, the synthesis of my own perspective, I guess you could say, of how to work all these guys together in ways that they disagree. I guess that might be considered something unique to me. But this episode, we're going to focus on Francis Schaeffer primarily, and his book, which had a huge impact on me, called Art and the Bible. I highly recommend this book. It discusses how to understand art, how to evaluate art, why art is important, why art should be important to Christians, and most prominently and interestingly, how to create art as a Christian. Schaeffer is very interested in inspiring the next generation of Christian artists who will carry the torch of honoring God and displaying His glory by creating beautiful art. Schaeffer does a lot of heavy lifting on why we should care about art as Christians. I quoted him a few times in our first episode to establish a definition of art. His insights distinguished the difference between art and propaganda. Schaeffer is big on art not merely being a vessel for the intellect. As soon as the message overpowers the medium, it has become propaganda. That's why, by the way, Christian films are almost always bad. The goal is to get a message across, not to create art or impart beauty. And that's a serious mistake. Schaeffer says art is not to be solely a vehicle for some sort of self-conscious evangelism. Don't create propaganda for Jesus. No one will like it. But, Christians will pretend to like it because they feel like they're supposed to in order to root for the team, right? Secular artists make this same mistake too. They're always trying to deliver a message, get some point across, make a bold statement, or get their message out somehow. True art doesn't always have to do that. True art is supposed to be valuable in and of itself, not just for what it says. But that being said, Schaeffer is adamant that true art must express a worldview, because art is an expression of the mannishness of man. A part of that mannishness is going to portray the way the artist conceptualizes the world, because human beings, unlike animals, have a concept for what the world is like, a worldview. If the art doesn't have a worldview, on Schaeffer's view, it's probably not art. And we can define worldview broadly here. Even a landscape painting can say something powerful about the nature of the world. Do you see it in bright colors or dark colors? Is it vibrant or muted? Beautiful? Lonely? Dark? Dangerous? Different depictions of nature end up being important. Some see nature as this beautiful force for good and healing. Others see it as a kill or be killed eternal battle for survival. For Schaeffer, it is important that Christians analyze the worldview of the artist with a critical eye. Humans are mimicking God when we create, but unlike God, we are not omniscient, so our art forms can influence the appreciator's worldview regardless of whether it is true or false. Because art is so incredibly powerful in its ability to persuade, we must analyze the ideas conveyed in art from a Christian perspective in order to reject what is false and praise what is true. Notice that what Schaeffer doesn't say is that if you're a Christian, you should only appreciate art which agrees with your worldview. No, that's called indoctrination. You need to be exposed to ideas which are contrary to your worldview. You even need to be exposed to beautiful ideas that are contrary to your worldview. And what you need to do is challenge them. You need to think, why do people find this beautiful? Why might I find this beautiful? What about it is actually alluring? And I think a mature person can appreciate a work of art, whether it's a film or a book, and then step back and criticize the ideas behind the art in order to understand it even better. I don't see appreciation and critical thinking as competing goods, and neither does Schaeffer. The most significant contribution Schaeffer offers is a 4-layered analysis for how we can judge art as Christians, or really as anybody. This is interesting. You may agree or you may disagree. You may like Lewis's approach better, or you may like Schaeffer's approach better. Remember, for Lewis, it's far more important to analyze the subjective experience of the viewer rather than the art itself. But I think that some objective criterion might be helpful for distinguishing good art from bad art. I'll explain how I integrate Schaeffer's valuable insights after I explain what they are. For Schaeffer, there are 4 essential components to art. If an artist's full body of work lacks one of these, it is either not actually art or you haven't looked hard enough. It might also be important to note, before continuing, that when Schaeffer talks about art, he is not just talking about high art, such as painting, sculpture, poetry, and classical music, but also books, posters, flower arrangements, novels, theater, cinema, and popular music, and rock. Notice the significance of a quote-unquote fundamentalist Christian in the 80s calling rock music art. There is no snobbery in Schaeffer, nor was there any in Lewis. Okay, 4 categories of evaluation. The first category by which we can evaluate art is technical excellence. No surprise there. Does the artist display skill and talent that is impressive in its own right? There should be a skill involved in crafting art, and the more skill necessary to create the artwork at hand, the more it ought to be valued in this category. Schaeffer stresses that Christians should not dismiss an artist's skill just because we disagree with the worldview of the artist. The second criterion is validity, or what might be a better term now is purity. What Schaeffer means by this is the motivation of the artist. Was he paid to create a mural for a king? Is it just a job like a cartoonist at a fair? Is the artist trying to achieve social status or get attention with a shock piece? I think we all roll our eyes a little when our favorite band writes the most mainstream song possible in a clear attempt to get as many people as possible to like it. Or maybe get a spot on primetime radio. For Schaeffer, artwork has to be an honest expression of the artist. It has to be pure, or in his words, valid. Otherwise, the work is marred. Thirdly, intellectual content. And what Schaeffer here means is the moral and truth value which comes through the artwork. Here, Schaeffer would have us evaluate the worldview of the artist and weigh the value of it in its relationship to the artwork. Here, he reminds us that non-Christians are perfectly capable of creating Christian art by communicating a Christian worldview. There are archetypes or lessons about sacrifice, for example, which might impart valuable moral lessons which also correspond with how the world really is. It might also be true that when the artist portrays both the savagery and the beauty of mankind, which is a Christian idea, that when they portray that well, it should be considered a Christian worldview. They should even be given high marks for it. For Schaeffer, intellectual content is essentially the worldview of the artist and of the individual piece. And to be clear, the artist doesn't have to be a Christian to portray a Christian worldview. Of course, we define truth from a Christian perspective, but all truth is Christian truth. All truth is God's truth, if Christianity is true. That's why Schaeffer stresses that not all Christian art is religious art. You're going to hear me say that a few times. You don't have to discuss religious themes at all for it to be a Christian piece. The fourth and final criterion is what he calls vehicle. What he means by this is the integration of the style with the message, or the worldview. In episode 11, titled Artists, Philosophers, and the Power of Narrative, I talked about how Picasso's painting, De Moisy d'Avignon, pictured the deconstruction of modern man with his former identities. And T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland had the fractured and grammatically incorrect lines of poetry carrying a meaning of their own. On Schaeffer's view, these men deserve immense respect because the worldview or message they were trying to communicate fit perfectly with the style they chose to use. Both men even invented new styles in order to formulate a new message, and it changed the world. Schaeffer says that both men deserve very high marks for matching their worldview with the vehicle. On a more everyday level, we might think of a super upbeat pop song, but then when you actually listen to the lyrics, they're about suicide and depression or something really dark. That's kind of a mismatch of vehicle to message that Schaeffer thinks hurts the artistic quality of the piece. Now, Schaeffer's four methods of evaluation, technical excellence, validity or purity, intellectual content or worldview, and finally vehicle or message matching the style, these four categories may not be the final say in artistic appreciation because the evaluation of each category is still subjective. It's going to be hard to make use of these standards. It also might be difficult to apply these one-size-fits-all standards to all art. I mean, how does an ice sculpture exactly fit here? But I think the categories are genius. And even if there is some play in the joints, I think they are useful for at least giving us a direction for how to appreciate art. It can also be so hard to take a Picasso or a Leonardo da Vinci and really extract all that's there. Categories of artistic judgment can be really helpful in guiding us to look at the right things, even though I think Lewis's overall system that we've been talking about does a better job at characterizing a coherent philosophy as a whole. At some point, arguing about the skill of the artist becomes tedious and pointless. Lewis would say it's better to evaluate the experience of the viewer rather than nitpick the details of the work. But it's clear that there are details of the work that are important. And if they are important, and if we're going to talk about them, Schaeffer's categories are going to be really helpful. Again, those categories are technical excellence, validity, intellectual content, and vehicle. I think these categories, if you will, can be integrated into our Christian philosophy by saying, hey, when you're reading a book or watching a movie or observing a painting, ask these questions. Is the skill involved excellent? Is it a genuine expression of the artist's ideas? Is the worldview which comes through true, or are parts of it true and praiseworthy? Does the style of the art match the message being communicated? And the more definitively you say yes, the better the work is. This exists in tension with Lewis, because Lewis would say that you're asking way too many questions. But I think we can integrate these views by acknowledging the broad usefulness of Schaeffer's categories, but also admitting that at some point it is going to fail to breach the subjective-objective gap. There will still be people who just don't agree with your ratings in these categories, given for a particular piece of art. When that happens, even though it is Schaeffer's questions which are the ones which you're going to use to pivot around or to try to reconcile your critical differences, at the end of the day, it's Lewis's view that is going to transcend the noise when the dialogue eventually deteriorates and everyone goes home. At some point, you'll have to say, maybe there's something here that I'm missing. Or, maybe 20 years later, the other guy will forget all about his favorite piece that he was arguing with you about forever and discover that it actually wasn't that good after all. Furthermore, I think Schaeffer's categories can help you discern whether the art you are appreciating is actually good, or whether you're just indulging in what Lewis would call egoistic castle building. Are you just peddling this opinion because you have nostalgia from childhood, or you have franchise or artist loyalty? Or is this something that is genuinely an impressive work of art? If you can articulate specific instances of technical excellence, or a theme which communicates some aspect of worldview which you really love, or if you can talk about how the message coincides with the medium in a harmonious and beautiful way, then it looks like you really are enjoying a beautiful piece of art. But if you can't, hey man, it's okay to just turn your brain off and veg out. Just don't call it art. Moving on from Schaeffer's four categories, I want to talk about Schaeffer's encouragements for Christian artists. Schaeffer says that if you are creating art, and you're doing so because it's beautiful and you enjoy it, then you're glorifying God in the process. Schaeffer even encourages his students to write love poetry for fellow students if they feel so inclined. That too can be a way of glorifying God. He reminds us that Christian art is by no means always religious art. The Song of Solomon is an entire book of the Bible, which is a beautiful, sexually charged love poem which never even mentions God, Jesus, salvation, or anything. And interpreters get their shorts in a bunch trying to shove religious content into the interpretation. But you can have Christian art which never mentions doctrine or theology, and it still glorifies God. Christian art doesn't have to carry religious overtones. The Bible doesn't even always carry religious overtones. There are stories in the Old Testament about Israel's war heroes, entire chapters dedicated to the mighty men of old. There are entire sections of Scripture dedicated to explaining how beautiful certain religious artifacts were, and they were described for their beauty and their craftsmanship in their creation, not just their religious significance. We must remember that any work which portrays a Christian worldview is Christian art, even if it wasn't a Christian who created it. The next contribution which Schaeffer brings to the table is a distinguishing between two types of art that Christians should be primarily focused on in their themes. For Schaeffer, a Christian artist should capture either the major theme or the minor theme. Ideally, a Christian artist captures both themes in their career, with a slight preference towards the major theme. Now, the major theme has to do with the beauty and the goodness of creation, the idea that life is ultimately good. The major theme includes the idea that there's a purpose and meaning to life, and that we should be optimistic towards being. This has to be balanced, however, with the minor theme, which is the reality of sin, destruction, evil, chaos, death, and imperfection. The major theme carries Christian morality and metaphysics. The major theme says, there is good in the world, not just evil. There is morality, not just biological conditioning and social contract. There is truth, not just absurdity and interpretation. There is love, not just sex and mutual exploitation. The minor theme says, yes, sometimes evil wins in the short run. Yes, man is broken and evil and corrupt. Christian art should have both tragedy and optimism. As artists, we should take our cue from the Apostle Paul, who pictures the Christian life this way. Speaking of the gospel, he says, quote, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our immortal flesh." End quote. 2 Corinthians 4, 7-11. Schaeffer says that this is what Christian art should be like. Too much optimism, and it becomes romantic. Too much tragedy, and it becomes redemptionless. The totality of our artwork, our full career as an artist, should express all aspects of life, not just the dark ones and not just the bright ones. The Christian life is tragic because of sin, but triumphant because of God. God did not just create religious objects, so we too, when we are creating or considering art, must not be afraid to enjoy the universe as God created it and reflect it back to Him in admiration. Another thing that Schaeffer talks about is artistic style. He was writing in the 80s, where among conservatives there was a lot of snobbery about music. Much of it carried over from the 70s and continued on to the 90s. The drums were Satan's instrument. An electric guitar in a worship service? Are you crazy? Are you trying to summon the devil? Or even worse, Gene Simmons? But Schaeffer takes a firm stand here. He says styles of art form change, and that is okay. Schaeffer denounces snobbery about any style of music or style of painting. English poetry rhymes, Hebrew poetry has alliteration and parallelism. Is either wrong? Of course not. Christian artists are free to choose the style their culture has given them, free to be an English Christian or a Japanese Christian, or a Turkish Christian or an Albanian Christian. Feel free to write Christian metal or Christian rap or Christian science fiction. There is no such thing as a godly or ungodly style. Christians are at liberty with the style of their art. At the same time, Schaeffer warns us not to be naive. Some styles carry connotations and symbolic meanings which can be an obstacle or threat to your work. Punk rock, for example, is usually associated with young, nihilistic, troublemaking teenagers. Rap music is usually associated, or at least was associated, with the ghetto lifestyle, which glorifies drugs, sex, and violence. In order to determine whether your artistic genre or style is too much of an obstacle for your message, Schaeffer suggests you simply ask. Ask the people who are critiquing your art whether they are picking up the major or minor themes that you're trying to communicate. If they don't even notice that your music was any different than everyone else's music, maybe you aren't overcoming the stigma of the genre well enough. Well, that's basically all I have on Schaeffer. Now let's talk about Aristotle and a new idea in the philosophy of art. I think I've mentioned a few times that some of my ideas about art have been influenced by Aristotle. Well, that isn't technically correct, because Aristotle doesn't say a lot about art. And what he does say is very specific. Really, I should say that some of my ideas about art are neo-Aristotelian, because there's a new field of aesthetics and philosophy called virtue aesthetics, which is roughly based on some of the ideas from Aristotle's virtue ethics. The theory is a little complex and very technical, not to mention brand new, but I have some bullet points which have become foundational pillars of my view of art, which I think are important. The first idea is that aesthetic activity is essential to human flourishing, or human happiness. Human beings need art to live fully actualized lives. Meaning, you don't need it to live, but without it, you certainly aren't living optimally. The second idea in ancient ethics is that morality is not primarily a matter of doing the right thing, but instead of becoming a certain kind of person. The parallel for art is that art appreciation is not about specific pieces of art. It's about certain kinds of art appreciators. The goal isn't to create a masterpiece, but to be the kind of person who can appreciate a masterpiece. That's where we focus our attention, on the individual and their ability to see and understand and enjoy. It's about building character. It's about building the capacity for deep and beautiful experiences, instead of preferring your Instagram feed or something like that. Aristotle believed that in order to be happy as a human being, in order to achieve your purpose, you need to be a virtuous person. That is, you must be courageous or just, etc., etc. That's a part of virtue ethics. The idea here in virtue aesthetics and neo-Aristotelianism is that in order to be a fully developed person, in order to fulfill your purpose as a human being, your telos, your goal, your aim, you must enjoy art. Enjoying and creating beauty is a part of what it means to be human, just like being a moral agent is part of what it means to be human. The third idea, which comes from a neo-Aristotelian conception of aesthetics, has to do with our capacity for art appreciation and creation. That is to say, we can appreciate art well, or we can appreciate it poorly. Our capacity for artistic appreciation needs to be honed and strengthened if we want to fully develop and become happy, or complete, or achieve our purpose. However you prefer to frame it. What I mean is that we must actually recognize our capacity for artistic expression and practice. We can do it well, or we can do it poorly. You may notice that this point is directly opposed to a postmodern understanding of what art is. On a postmodern conception, you can't do it well or badly because there's no definition of art at all. Art is just whatever you like. And so if you like it, I guess you're doing it. There's no good or bad. It's binary. The fourth parallel is that just like there are right or wrong answers to ethical questions, there are right and wrong answers to aesthetic ones. Like I said before, neo-Aristotelians think that instead of asking abstract questions about art and having complex rules drive our discussion, we should be talking about the character of the art appreciator. Obviously, this isn't to say that we can't make statements which are true, like murder is wrong, or skill is directly correlated to artistic quality. But it does mean that when we are thinking about murder or artistic skill, we should analyze the character of the subject, their motives, their desires, their goals, their aims, and their actions, not just the abstract idea of the action or artwork itself. With that being said, I think it's time to conclude our series on a Christian philosophy of art and beauty. It seems fitting, then, to summarize what we've learned. Beauty is an ontological reality, like truth or goodness. All art strives to touch beauty, just like all argument tries to touch truth, or all moral behavior tries to touch goodness. But it's the wrong question to ask whether Claude Monet is better than Van Gogh. That's a stupid question, just like asking whether Mozart is better than Beethoven. They both have crossed the threshold. They are beyond the pale. As an artist is creating their art, they are shaping a particular piece of art out of an infinite realm of potential. Should they use this note or that one? This shade of blue or this shade of blue? This camera angle or that camera angle? Should we hire this actor or this one? As the particularities are chosen, each decision is trying to touch something beautiful, something transcendent, something perfect, something wonderful. As the artist reaches for this themselves, they're also trying to pass it on to those who might come after them and appreciate it just like they're appreciating it. Once an artwork is finished, it will be a wholly unique instantiation of beauty. And because it is absolutely and supremely unique, there's some sense in which better or worse questions have no meaning. There's nothing like it to say that it is better or best. It's just breathtaking. And that's what Mozart's Requiem or the Sistine Chapel is. It's breathtaking. And if you can't see that, then there's something wrong with you, not the art. The particularity of art is that it tries to reach beauty in the only way it can, in its own completely unique particularity. The only relevant variable is you. The art doesn't change, your perception of it changes, and it varies from person to person. So when you're talking about someone's taste in art, what you're asking is, where do you see beauty? Do you see beauty more over here or over there? Do you see it in that author or this one? Do you see it in that painting or this one? Because beauty is all around us. And if it's a really good piece, then it's infinitely capable of producing a beautiful and sublime reaction over and over again as the years go on. And thus we get an art appreciator, as Lewis talked about. So what is good taste? How do you have good taste on our view? Well, good taste means that you're a true art appreciator and not just a consumer. You'll recall that an art appreciator is the kind of person who deeply loves the art that they've been exposed to. They see it for what it is, a well that just continually refreshes and nourishes their soul. They just love to come back again and again, cherishing their favorite lines, their favorite scenes, their favorite characters. This is opposed to a consumer who just wants the entertainment value of the art, and then they're ready to move on. A consumer enjoys the art only as long as it takes to appreciate it or consume it, and then move on. But an art appreciator looks at the art and cherishes it forever. They will reread and reread it if it's a book as decades go by, or if it's a film, they'll buy it on Blu-ray and they'll watch it again and again and again. Over decades perhaps. I mean, we all have busy lives, but you see what an art appreciator is. It's someone who really loves movies, and this movie particularly, because of this, and oh, isn't that so good? And that doesn't fade as time passes. If it did fade as time passed, it would show that, well, they just liked it for what it did for them in that moment. And it wasn't really about the art. It was about where they were and how that piece of content interacted with them on a psychological level. But it's true art, or a true art appreciator who's appreciating true art, when they continue to love and cherish it over and over again as the decades pass. We get this from Lewis, and the obvious objection to Lewis's paradigm is that everything is somebody's favorite thing. I mean, if you search wide enough, you search far enough, you will find someone who thinks this movie, which is terrible, you'll find someone who absolutely loves it. The problem with this objection, though, is that not everyone who loves this particular movie that's garbage is a true art appreciator. And even if someone does cherish something their whole lives, it could still be for egoistic castle building, and it could just be because they're really loyal to that piece of art, or they have nostalgia because when they were a kid, they used to really read it and love it. So it's very challenging to sometimes splice through the difference between psychological mishap and true art appreciator. And yes, it's pretty subjective, but If you can see with wisdom the difference between an art appreciator and a consumer, and someone who deeply cherishes a important and valuable and amazing piece of art versus someone who just appreciates something that's really not that good, but they have a personal and private attachment to it, then the paradigm works wonders. It's important to remember that just because it's someone's favorite thing doesn't mean they're an art appreciator. And just because it's someone's favorite thing doesn't mean it's that good. Okay, back to good taste. We commonly think of people who have good taste as people who deeply enjoy the art that they do appreciate. I think this is the best definition of someone who has good taste, someone who is a true art appreciator, even if their horizon isn't extremely wide. Of course, a broad horizon is helpful, and being the kind of person who will enjoy good art, even if they haven't experienced it yet, someone who's open to new experiences, can be someone who has good taste, or we can say that they have good taste. But I still think that Lewis's definition is the most important thing here. Someone with good taste is someone who is a true art appreciator, and not just a consumer. Someone who isn't a snob or an elitist looking for a social status, but someone who really enjoys a piece of art for what it is. I think it's true that someone with good taste is always willing to look for the next beautiful thing that they can enjoy, but I don't want to reduce good taste to be whoever's open to the most new experiences. It's perfectly possible to have your 4 or 5 all-time favorite books, and if you just read and reread those your entire life, you can still technically have good taste. The deeper you appreciate truly good pieces of art is the mark, or at least should be the mark, of how good taste you actually have. If someone can tell you about their favorite book for hours and hours, going in detail about all of their favorite characters and scenes, being brought to tears while they're laughing, and all these sorts of things, then they have good taste. Now, obviously, like Lewis said, someone who doesn't enjoy a wide variety of art can just kind of inhabit a tiny world. But it shouldn't just be that the person who's read the most stuff has the best taste. The age-old problem of art evaluation is objective criterion versus personal bias. A good trick question can be phrased, is the toddler's drawing good? One of the things we realized after David Hume is that it's a sign of wisdom to tell the difference between the question, do I like it, and the question, is it good? When your 2-year-old scribbles out their family with a crayon, that's the kind of thing that will bring you to tears. You might hang it on your fridge and keep it forever. But a wise parent knows not to try and sell it to an art museum. There is something unique and beautiful in this piece of art that only you get to treasure, and that's why it's yours to keep. On my view, I want to say definitively that some art is bad. That doesn't mean there isn't a use for it. That doesn't mean that it's bad in every situation. There's a time and a place for everything. You better believe that you're a terrible DJ if you only play classical music at someone's wedding. You don't get to say that you have a more exquisite taste than everyone else just because you're not going to play a song that we can dance to. But despite the fact that there is a time and a place for everything, I want to be able to definitively say that Stephenie Meyer's Twilight is not as good as Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Perhaps a philosophy of art should help us identify bad art, even more importantly than it is to identify good art. John Milton is good, and if you don't like him, you either have bad taste because you don't like anything that's good, or you are just incongruent. You just are biased or personally poorly predisposed, blinded. Perhaps you don't speak English. Maybe you just haven't read him yet. Whatever. And if you're incongruent, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have bad taste. It's only if you find yourself unable to enjoy anything very deeply that is evidence that, okay, maybe you don't have very good taste. If you can't enjoy any type of deeper literature or deeper film or deeper anything like you ought to, then you're a consumer. Now, it's okay to be a consumer, but like I said in episode 2, I think you're missing out. If you just listen to the music that's on the radio or watch only the biggest Marvel movies or Fast and Furious movies and that's it, then you're missing out. You're not a bad person, you're just missing out. There's more. You're like a punk rocker who finally admits that maybe other music is still good, but I still don't enjoy it. I don't enjoy classical music. Well, you can continue your whole life without classical music. You'll be just fine. But you might be short-selling yourself, because the most powerful and impactful and beautiful experiences that music can deliver, well, there's a reason that people are still listening to music that's 350 years old. And maybe you're missing out if you don't refine and develop and practice your taste in music. Now, maybe also you just haven't been exposed. You need a guide. Googling classical music and clicking on the first thing that comes up is probably not going to suddenly blow your mind. I mean, just imagine if you did that to any other genre of music, you would probably be very disappointed. Since I've ended up talking about classical music so much, I thought I might give you some suggestions. Claire De Lune by Claude Debussy is one of my favorite pieces. Reverie by Debussy is also one of my favorite pieces. That whole symphony, I think, is amazing. Chopin's Nocturnes are really, really good. Gymnopédies by Eric Satie. That's spelled Gymnopedies. I think it's French. Actually, my all-time favorite concerto is Sergei Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. I think I might have brought it up on the podcast before. I know it serves as the intro music to, I want to say, one of Dostoevsky's pieces, but yeah, those are my favorites. Look those up, listen to them. You might actually love them because they're deep, they're powerful, they're emotional, they're engaging. Okay, what the heck was I talking about? Oh yeah, you're missing out if you don't enjoy art deeply. If you aren't an art appreciator, you're missing out. But it's still okay to be a consumer. You're not a worse person. You're just, you're missing out. That's basically it. My philosophy of art uses Lewis's system of art appreciators versus consumers, but integrates Schaeffer's evaluative methodology. If Lewis is correct, then there should be objective features which are conducive to good reading and bad reading, or good viewing of paintings or not good viewing of paintings, or good listening to music or whatever. Surely the subjective experience of the reader is the most important thing to think about, but Lewis himself makes value judgments regarding actual works, not just readers. Therefore, I think evaluation is unavoidable. What else are you going to do when sharing the beauty of literature, if not making an argument? Perhaps it is one which argues with beauty as well as with truth, but it is an argument nonetheless. So I think we can evaluate art and critique it and say that some things are better than other things based on objective criterion. But when those arguments just kind of don't go anywhere, I think Lewis's philosophy, you can step back, use it, and recognize, hey, there's art appreciators, there's art consumers. Maybe we're two art appreciators and we just don't see eye to eye. Or maybe down the road, it'll turn out that I missed something or that he was missing something. To conclude our series on a Christian philosophy of art, I want to say that the church has been horribly bad at art for, as far as I can tell, a while now. Our preaching exposes our disinterest in what we talk about. Our Bible studies forget that Scripture is a vibrant piece of literature. Our buildings are built like homeless shelters. Our music is often cringy and preachy. Our movies are propaganda films with laughable acting and terrible writing. The only reprieve from this in recent memory, of course, is C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And I'm sure there are other notable exceptions which I'm not thinking about right now. Christians used to be at the forefront of artistic endeavors, using their passion for the divine as an expression of human progress. We were passionate about portraying the good as attractive and the evil as repulsive. That's what Tolkien did, that's what Lewis did, and that's what all the Christian giants have done before us. And they made an enormous impact. We must remember that and be bold with our creation and enjoyment of art. On a more positive note, I hope our podcast has helped you appreciate the power and beauty of literature. I guess so far, it's mostly been Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but I'm really excited for more that's to come. I can't wait to get into the Greeks or American literature or English literature. I can't wait for all of the beauty, faith, and reason that is slated to come onto this podcast. And I hope that you've enjoyed our excursion into the principles which make beauty and art appreciation important in the first place. Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast.